So this is about an experiment in the Bahamas aimed at understanding the effects of a large lizard predator on the population dynamics and interactions between two smaller anolis lizards. Let's get my advancer. So the broad context for this experiment is the existence of a replicated convergent adaptive radiation of anolis lizards on the 4 Greater Antillean islands: Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico. And what's happened is that on each of those large islands, ancestral lizards arrived and adaptively differentiated into different ecomorph categories distinguished by their morphology, behavior, coloration. And you can see here 2 examples of those ecomorphs. So the trunk ground ecomorph is characterized by brown or gray coloration, typically perches low on tree trunks or close to the ground, darts to the ground to pick up food. And over here we have the trunk crown species that live higher up in the canopy. Typically are green or bluish green colored, and both these 2 ecomorphs and the other ecomorphs that have evolved have morphological traits that have adapted them to the particular lifestyle. So in the case of the trunk ground anoles, longer limbs that enable faster running on relatively broad substrates. In the case of trunk crown anoles, shorter limbs that enable better locomotion on narrow perches in the higher canopy. Obviously, the coloration is cryptic, brown and gray for closer to the ground and on tree trunks, and green for in the foliage. And the curious thing is that this pattern of highly repeatable on large islands in the Caribbean of ecomorph evolution is not evident on the mainland. So in the mainland, anoles in Central and South America are equally diverse, equally speciose, but do not have not evolved into these same sort of highly stereotyped ecomorphs. So this is just a picture of the phylogeny on the left-hand side, where the letters going up on the right indicate the Greater Antillean island from which the species or the clade originated, and the ecomorph categories are down at the bottom. And I mentioned already the trunk ground and trunk crown. There's also crown giant that live higher up and are big, grass bush anoles, trunk anoles that live intermediate in the canopy and twigs. So these lizards have really finely partitioned the available habitat space. You see that the whole canopy is basically filled by lizards, and they're occupying these characteristic niches and have mostly evolved in situ. Now, a lot of work on this has been done by Jonathan Lossos, who wrote a great book, this one in 2009, called Lizards in an Evolutionary Tree. And among the many fascinating things that he talks about in the book is some speculation on why there's this difference between mainland and island anoles in the nature of the radiation. One is adaptive, and one is just a plain old radiation. And one idea that's been out there for quite some time, back to 1979, is that in the islands, it's been predominantly competition shaping the evolution of these assemblages, and character displacement, and that's leading to this filling of Grinnellian niche space. Whereas on the mainland, anoles are primarily limited by predation. But Losos goes on to say that there isn't a lot of evidence that predation actually is a significant factor in communities, but that doesn't rule out the possibility that predation might have driven the divergence of species to use different microhabitats and resources. So this is classically assumed to be competition, species moving away from each other to minimize the effects of interspecific competition, but it's possible that predation or other types of ecological interactions might have contributed to this pattern. And he says, in other words, it's possible that ecological diversity of forms we see in anole communities might be the ghost of predation past, as opposed to Connell's ghost of competition past, which is the canonical explanation. And I read this book when I was at Harvard as a postdoc, spending some time with Jonathan's lab, and it was very influential for me in thinking about ecology and possibilities for new projects. And he says in there that there are some experiments that could be done that would help shed light on this issue. And one would be to study the role of predation in structuring anole communities. And he references here our experimental work with Lyocephalus, that's a curly-tailed lizard. You're going to be hearing about it a lot in this talk. In the Bahamas, suggests that predation can be a very important factor affecting the ecology of populations. So what Losos and Shaner and Dave Spiller and colleagues have done is study the effects of this large, chunky, primarily ground-dwelling lizard that is saurophagous. It eats lizards, but it's highly omnivorous as well. It can eat lizards. It can eat almost, and I have observed that it will eat almost anything that moves and many things that do not move, including dead hermit crabs and sometimes fruits that have fallen from trees. And Shaner et al. Introduced these Lyocephalus curly-tailed lizards onto a replicated series of small islands in the Bahamas and traced their effects on Anolis sagrii, which is one of the trunk ground ecomorphs. And what they found is, they've published, as I'm sure a lot of you know, a long series of papers, influential papers on this set of experiments. This is one 2002 Ecological Monographs paper that provides a summary of the work up until that point. And what they found was that, first of all, as shown in this graph, the number of the density and abundance of Anolis sagrii was dramatically reduced, and almost immediately dramatically reduced by the presence of the curly-tailed predator. Also that Anolis sagrii, this lizard that has evolved to use terrestrial habitats for the most part, led to a behavioral response wherein lizards moved up in the canopy to avoid predation. So you see the black line here in black circles are where the predator is present, and you see the perch height shoots up almost instantaneously following the introduction of predators. And corresponding with that move upwards on these small islands, islands on the order of 100 square meters, was a decrease in perch diameter. So when you're close to the ground is a very broad surface to run on. Tree trunks are often fairly broad substrates. As you move up into the canopy, you get into smaller twigs and thinner perches. So a whole suite of effects on resident trunk ground anole species from this predator. And one of the most exciting things that they found was that they were able to measure the selective pressure exerted by this predator introduction. So this is a one-page paper with one figure, which I've blown up the figure on your right there. And the top left panel shows that on islands with predators, lizards didn't spend any time on the ground. So that's basically recapitulating the result on the previous slide. They moved up into the trees and very rarely occurred on the ground. The top right panel shows that perch diameter decreased in association with that move upwards, again recapitulating that previous result. But the new result here was that the direction of selection on hind limb length, that critical morphological feature that determines your ability to locomote on substrates of different breadth, reversed over time. So initially there was selection for lizards to have longer hind limbs. So within the first 6 months of the experiment, there was significant selection to have longer hind limbs, which they attributed to the fact that the lizards that couldn't run fast to escape the predator on the ground got eaten. But then as the experiment progressed, there was a switch such that there was selection for shorter limbs. And they attributed that to after the lizards that had tried to run away and failed got eaten, the ones that survived were the ones that moved up. And those that moved up survived at a greater rate if they had shorter hind limbs. So this is I'm omitting a lot of very interesting work by this team on this project, but these are the really salient details for the experiment I'm going to tell you about. So our question was, this is a riff on this experiment it's basically a minor twist. So we also had islands in the Bahamas. We also had Anolis sagrii as a resident anole, and Lyocephalus carinatus as an introduced top predator. But we added one anole species, specifically a trunk crown anole, a green anole. I'm going to refer to the trunk crown anole as green anoles and the trunk ground anole as brown anoles throughout the talk. We introduced into this picture another potentially competing anole species, a trunk crown species, Anolis smaragdinus, which is closely related to the Anolis carolinensis, the green anole that occurs in the southeastern United States. And the question is, how does the presence of this predator affect the interaction between these two species, the niche structure of the community, competition, strength of competition, their ability to coexist, and potentially adaptive evolution. And this is actually not this photo is a lie. It's not from the Bahamas or from our experiment. This is a photo from we took with the Losos lab in 2009 a lizard collecting trip to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and so these are the Cuban. This is Anolis porcatus, and this is the local Cuban trunk ground anole, the name of which I forget. But you can see that they're actually displaying at each other. So there's some behavioral agonism occurring here between these two different ecomorph classes. So what did our experiment look like specifically? All right, we started with islands that were occupied by the trunk ground anole, the brown anole, Anolis sagrii. And we had 4 islands in that treatment. We had a treatment where we had the brown anole and its congener, Anolis smaragdinus, the trunk crown species. And I'm going to call that treatment plus G for plus green. And then we had a treatment with the predator and the brown anole, so the same treatment as in the Shaner et al. Studies. And finally, the most interesting one, the really truly novel one, was the community with all three species, the predator and both anoles. So that's 16 total islands. And we really focused on two competing alternative hypotheses, and they are genuine alternatives. So the first is what we would call a keystone predation hypothesis. So as in Payne's classic studies of sea stars and Middleist mussels on rocky shores, we thought it was possible that the interaction strength between the ground-dwelling predator, this stocky, chunky, non-climbing ground-dwelling predator, and the ground brown anole would be really strong. So they would, as in the Shaner experiments, the predators would eat a lot of lizards and devastate their populations, which is what Shaner et al. Found. And that would lead to weak to negligible competition between the two anoles, and that relaxation of competition would lead to a positive effect on the colonizing population of green anoles. Seems plausible, and that, if true, would tend to facilitate the establishment of green anoles and to promote coexistence, because there's an asymmetric interaction between the predator and the ground-dwelling prey. The other hypothesis was more of a focusing less on so the Shaner et al. Studies showed that there were strong consumptive and behavioral effects. And the first of these hypotheses focuses on if it's primarily a consumptive effect. If it's primarily a behavioral effect and the lizards move up rapidly to avoid predation, what we might get is something akin to intensified competition within the refuge. And the refuge is the high perches where the predator doesn't occur. So that would look like this. We'd have, this is a behavioral effect of predators on their potential prey, but that actually leads to intensified competition up in the canopy. Brown anoles move up, and there they compete with green anoles, and that ends up having a negative effect on both anole species. Will tend to reduce the likelihood that green anoles will successfully establish when we introduce them, will tend to inhibit the likelihood of long-term stable coexistence. And so that would be a negative indirect effect of the predator on the arboreal anole species, even though they're very unlikely to come into contact for the most part, given the different habitat they occupy. So we got permission from the Bahamian government to use 16 of their islands to do this, and they are just shown here. This is the island Staniel Key. This is where we sleep when we stay there, and then there's a bunch of islands just offshore. And these bigger islands have different combinations of all three species in the study. And so what we're sort of doing is we're not moving anything outside of its native range by any means. We expect that there, and we've actually documented that there is some natural colonization of these islands by some of these species over time. We're just speeding that process up and doing it in a controlled and replicated way. So the islands there are shown with color corresponding to which treatment they occur in. And so this is a very distinctive set of islands, and we have 6 of our replicates are just in here. This is what that looks like flying in. So there's that horseshoe-shaped island, and this is one of our experimental islands. This is another one of our experimental islands. This is island number 1. This is what it looks like from the top down. Those are 2 18-foot Boston whalers for scale. So you see that there's enough vertical vegetation. So these are about an order of magnitude larger islands than those used by Shaner et al. In their studies. And we picked the 16 from among 25 candidates after ensuring that they were all occupied by Anolis sagrii, they didn't have any other lizards present, and that there was sufficient vertical habitat structure, sufficient woody canopy that the green anole would have a realistic shot at surviving. So here we are conducting a survey on that island number 1. There's Todd, one of the collaborators, Todd Palmer, collaborator on this experiment, standing atop island number 1. So we take our whalers out and head to the islands, and typically with a team of 4 to 6 people, we comprehensively survey them, and there's more survey pictures. We mark every lizard that we see with paint. And this is a little squirt gun that is sold by forestry suppliers. It's actually designed for foresters to blaze trees, but you can fill it with water-soluble, non-toxic, they say it's even drinkable by people safely, paint. And we go on each day, we go on 3 successive days. This is a method developed by Joan Roughgarden and one of her students in 1979. And it's been used by Shaner and colleagues ever since. It's a simple mark recite estimation method. So you go on day 1 with blue paint, and then you go on day 2 with red paint, and day 3 with yellow paint. And by the end of day 3, you've got lizards with blue paint, lizards with red paint, yellow paint, then you've got red and blue, red and yellow. You get the picture. And then the challenge is then estimating that number of lizards you didn't see based on the records of those that you did. And so here's some pictures of artistically decorated lizards. We try our best to lightly spritz them and not to sort of blow them off their perches with intense jet streams of paint. And I think we succeed for the most part. The curly tails, we're a little bit less delicate with them because first of all, they're nasty lizards. Just mean and brutish. And so we don't, and the paint doesn't stick to them as well. So we add a little bit more paint to the curly tails. But there's Todd in there in the bushes. He's got his notebook. He's got his squirt gun. And we have a team of 4 to 6 people trying to cover the whole island comprehensively. Each person tries to cover the whole island, and collectively we hope that we've done a good survey on each of the 3 days. So what has happened? The predator, starting from introduced propagules of 5 to 7 individuals per island, randomized across islands, has grown. The population has increased fairly steadily, not super dramatically, but to sizable populations with no significant differences depending on whether it's present just with the brown anole or with both anole species. The brown anole has had a good 6 years. So this is the population in the control treatment. It's been increasing. And we don't really know why, but we know that there's quite a bit of natural fluctuation in the abundance year to year, depending on the weather, depending on hurricanes, and things like that. We've been lucky we haven't had, well, until this past year, we didn't have any, we haven't had any major hurricanes yet, so we're looking forward to seeing what happened when we go back in May. On the islands with green anoles, so this is all relative. This is relative to so 1 is relative to the number present on the initial survey. And so on islands where we introduce green anoles, there's been a negative effect relative to control islands, but actually the net population has stayed more or less constant, even increased slightly over the 6 years. On islands with predators, we were surprised to see that we did not find the catastrophic, even after 6 years, the catastrophic, almost immediate, dramatic, precipitous decline in brown anole populations that Shaner et al. Did. Clearly a negative effect relative to the control islands, but not a substantial net decrease in the overall population. The only treatment with a net decrease in the overall population consistently and starting from basically year 2 of the experiment, 2013, was the treatment with both the green anoles and the predator. What about green anoles? So we introduced here 10 individuals, 5 males, 5 females, on each island in 2011. And on islands where they were present with Anola segrii, they have done quite well. The initial phase of logistic growth seems to have started to level out as of last year. On the islands with curly-tailed predators, and keep in mind the predator is mostly on the ground, and these guys are mostly in the leaves, in the top of the canopy. The populations have not grown at all on average. And I can actually show you I'm going to show you the trends for each individual island. And this is a log scale on the y-axis. And on every single island where they're present with just the brown anole, they've increased, and in some cases fairly dramatically. And they've increased on only one island with both, and that was only after after a period of decline. And they've gone. And then there's been zero net change on a second island, and there's been extinction as of January 2017 on 2 of the initial 4 islands with all 3 lizard species present. So the predator is having a negative effect clearly on the green anoles, despite the lack of habitat overlap. What about that habitat shift? So not surprisingly, so this is the relative height. This is perch height relative to the maximum perch height available in a given area. Unsurprisingly, the curly-tailed lizards are basically here on the ground. The brown anoles on islands, control islands and islands with green anoles, also stay pretty close to the ground, but then they move up on islands with predators, and that is consistent with previous work. And the green anoles don't have actually much room to move up because they're already almost at the top. So here's 1.0. This is the highest possible perch height, top of the canopy, and they're pretty close. They're and these are 95% confidence intervals. They're at sort of 75%, give or take, of the maximum perch height available. So maybe they move up a little bit more where predators are present, but not in a dramatic way. This is another way of looking more or less at the same thing. Proportion of individuals on the ground. Curly tails are almost all on the ground. Brown anoles, where present without predators, are frequently on the ground, more than 50%. But within 1 year of introducing 5 lizards per island, 5 predators per island, they had started to move up into the canopy, and that has maintained consistently throughout the rest of the experiment to date. And so those 2 pairs of treatments are highly significantly different. And green anoles are almost never on the ground. Very rarely, sort of 0%, 0 to 5, 0 to, I don't know, 0 to 3% throughout the experiment. Now, the evidence for spatial niche collapse, I think, is best evaluated in light of both perch diameter and perch height. So there's relative perch height here on the y-axis and perch diameter on the x-axis, and colors denote the different lizard species. And this graph is for 2015. So here are the curly tails on the ground and with very wide perches or very wide substrates. Here are the green anoles close to the top of the canopy and on very narrow perches. And then here are the brown anoles. So here they are on their control islands, and you see, in addition to being quite low and having fairly fat perches, they also have quite a lot of variability in their habitat use, both in terms of perch diameter and in terms of their vertical habitat use. They seem to actually move down slightly in green anoles, so possibly they're responding to the presence of a competitor. And then as you add predators, they move to thinner and higher perches. And we see this consistently. These are the same data, but for 2016. Same pattern. And so they're just zooming in on this a little bit to show you how the brown and green anoles are influenced by the presence of predators. So here is each species, brown anoles, green anoles. On here, the plus green treatment, so you see there's plenty of separation there in terms of their perch height. But on islands with predators, they start to overlap in the heights that in the perch heights that they're utilizing. And again, 2015 pattern consistent, observed again in 2016. And we have seen instances of agonistic interactions, as we did when we went to Gitmo. Here's a green anole and brown anole facing off on an island with predators. And this interaction, they chased each other around for a while, displaying at each other, and they never actually made contact as far as we saw, but clearly not liking each other, being in each other's space. And lest you doubt that that anoles can do damage to each other, I can assure you that they do. So these are two brown anoles fighting just on the porch of our cottage, not from the experiment. But this was a nasty fight. It lasted for about 30 minutes. Frequently, lizards will lose digits, sometimes even feet and limbs, and frequently tails. I don't know how frequently these conflicts end in death, but that may also happen. So this kind of interference, competition, and agonism is a big deal. All right, now that's sort of spatial habitat data suggesting evidence consistent with our hypothesis too. Moving up, intensifying competition, but what does that really mean? What is actually limiting them? And it might be food. So for this, those of you guys who were at my talk yesterday will have already seen this cute little animation. And because I don't have a specific animation for lizards, I'm just using the herbivore one again. So you're going to have to pretend that the plants, when they show up, are arthropods. But we take lizard dung, so we hold them in bags until they get the poop. We take the undigested animal arthropod cells and extract the DNA and match them to our arthropod reference library, which is much poorer, unfortunately, than our plant reference library for African herbivores. But the same principle applies. Here we're using the 16S as a marker as a general marker for arthropods in the diet. Here's Tyler Cartzenell, who has done much of this work, taking a fecal sample. Usually, so he's extracting a fecal sample, putting it into a tube on the boat while the rest of us work hard, helping him out, providing advice. And so this is the one completed project. So this is basically a proof of concept that this approach works. I actually don't want to talk about these all these figures, but this is a paper that just showed that the approach worked for anoles, for brown anoles only, that we could recover an average of 8 to 10 operational taxonomic units, a prey taxa per fecal sample across 3 different sampling periods. And we did some little comparisons just to see if there was major differences in the number of in the the diversity of female diets versus male diets, or in the composition of male and female diets, and we didn't really find much difference here intraspecifically among the anoles. We found that males and females basically ate the same thing, and we found no major year effects or season effects across the 3 sampling periods. Those are just a big cluster in these non-metric multidimensional scaling plots, where again proximity of points indicates similarity and points far apart indicate dissimilarity. So that was an intraspecific analysis, but what we really wanted to do is understand the interspecific patterns. So I'm going to now throw up a bipartite network of the 3 lizard species. I've put the arthropod taxa along the bottom, and I've put numbers indicating the 2 most common, most abundant prey items. One is a cockroach, and number 2 is a beetle, a weevil. So here are the lizards. Here's curly tails. They eat a lot of cockroaches, and they eat this is a Camponotus ant species there. So those 2 taxa are heavily represented in the diet, and then various other species across the arthropod spectrum, including some that we could only identify to the rather coarse taxonomic level of Arthropoda. Brown anoles also eat a lot of cockroaches, and their other main prey item is this beetle, Artipus floridanus, a weevil, the little leaf notcher. It's an agricultural pest in Florida. Choose distinctive notches in the margins of leaves. That'll become important towards the end of the talk. So you see quite a fair bit of overlap in the prey of these 2 taxa of these 2 lizards, which is not so surprising given their similarity in habitat preference. And then here's green anoles, and they also eat a lot of the Artipus weevil, and they also have a fair amount of overlap with brown anoles, but relatively little overlap with curly tails. Again, not so surprising. So the picture that's emerging here is these are sort of generalist predators eating what's available within their particular habitat stratum. We were able to detect treatment effects on consumption of the 2 most frequently eaten taxa. So this big cockroach, like this, Hemiblabra pabulator, is consumed frequently. This is relative read abundance, relative sequence read abundance in the fecal samples on the y-axis of each plot. Brown anoles eat a lot of them when predators are not present, but eat many fewer when predators are present. And this is a terrestrial cockroach that shelters under rocks and in leaf litter, so the green anoles don't encounter them much, don't eat them much. But the predator, when it comes in, eats a ton of them. And that, coupled with the effect of the predator on habitat use of the brown anole, probably explains why the brown anole eats fewer cockroaches when the predators are present. With respect to the Artipus, here, the brown anoles eat a decent, 10% of 10 to 15% of RRA on control islands. But when green anoles are introduced, green anoles are major predators of Artipus. Artipus is an arboreal little weevil that chews on leaves, and the green anoles take over, and the consumption of Artipus by brown anoles drops. And then when predators are present but not green anoles, brown anoles eat more Artipus than they eat on control islands, because presumably because they moved up in the canopy. So this is all fairly intuitive. And again, this arboreal weevil not eaten frequently by the terrestrial predator. Just in case you don't believe our DNA-based approach, I've included photos of the cockroach being eaten in various gruesome ways. here's the brown anole on a tree trunk. It has grabbed the cockroach from the ground and run up onto the tree trunk to eat it, which is a common behavior, irrespective of whether predators are present. And then this we see a lot. We see a lot of curly tails noshing on these big fat cockroaches, which are full of goodies. And they're soft-bodied. They have a very high fat content. So this is good food. We have observed interference competition. So here is juvenile curly-tailed lizards with an adult male sagrii. And basically what happened here is there's a termite trail going through the leaf litter. And the brown anole was foraging on it. You see it's got a little paint mark on its back. Brown anole was foraging on it. The curly tail came up, chased it away. And the brown anole was saying, hey, give me my termites back, displaying, but that had no effect. These two curly tails moved in and monopolized the resource. So this is suggesting that in addition to this effect as a potential predator and an inducer of fear, they are also competitors potentially for food. So we call that intraguild predation. Some fun video of some of the aforementioned. Let me check my time. I'm going to... Yeah, there's eating termites. And here is, what is it? Yep, termites again. And then here's the cockroach. So, lizards prey on insects, we've discovered. Now, if we want to represent the dietary niche in two-dimensional space, this is a multi-dimensional scaling plot. Again, proximity, similarity, distance, difference. And we see that there's kind of what looks like an arboreal dietary niche and a terrestrial dietary niche. This is all species, all treatments combined. So here's curly tails on the ground. They have this sort of 45-degree angle thing going on. And then here's the green anoles, and the brown anoles are eating sort of a subset of both of those things. And again, this is conflating the treatments, so we should look at it now by each treatment. So brown anoles in control islands eat Catholic diets. They are unconstrained. They move up, they eat arboreal things. They eat things on the ground. When you introduce predators who have a dietary niche, 2D dietary niche that looks like this, suddenly the brown anole niche looks like this, which is strikingly similar to a green anole niche, arboreal. When green anoles are present, the brown anoles shift back down to a subset of their control island niche. And when you add both species, the curly-tailed diet doesn't change much. The green anole diet doesn't change much. And the brown anoles seem to be sort of squeezed in between. They have an intermediate diet composition from what they have on any of the other treatments. Now, okay, so that's evidence, I think, that we don't just have to hand-wave about competition. I think this is pretty strong evidence for competition for food among these species that intensifies between the two anoles when the predators are added. We also did stable isotope analysis of tail tissue, which integrates over. So the metabarcoding is I don't actually know the gut retention time of lizards, but probably on the order of 24 to 72 hours. The stable isotope analysis integrates over a longer time period of months. And what we find here is that all lizards have more or less equal trophic position. So this is trophic position calculated per David Post's method, and we don't find what we might expect to see, that the predator has the highest trophic position. So it is the top predator, and this is again Sensu Post, but not the apical predator, in the sense that it is not always have the highest trophic position. So think of it potentially as like a grizzly bear. It can eat almost everything, but it's an omnivore, so there's some plant in the diet. Cockroaches have extremely low trophic position. They're detritivores. They have the lowest delta N15 of any of the insects that we measured, and they eat a lot of those. So they don't have very high trophic position. This also suggests that they don't eat lizards very frequently, because if they did, they would have higher trophic position. And that's all I'll say. And then, so the other interesting thing here is that on the islands with both, where we've added all three lizards, or we've added both predator and competitor, where Sagereye was already present, trophic position, mean individual trophic position is lowered significantly for all three species. Sort of anecdotally, to reinforce the notion that direct predation of curlytails, by curlytails on lizards is rare, we have seen it exactly once. This is the photo of when it happened, of a female that, I hope it wasn't us that caused it. We were walking through, and I saw a scuffling in the litter, looked down and saw this small female, brown or null adult female being consumed tail first by a curlytail. That's one out of, I don't know how many person hours in the field, a lot, one direct predation event. We have seen many, many, many harassments and near misses. So the picture that I get is that really the anoles are pretty nimble and pretty alert. On islands with predators, they are scared, and they stay high up. If they accidentally get knocked off a branch by a blast of paint, for example, a curlytail might come running. Suddenly it's just like this. You hear this scuffling. This curlytail comes running up, but the lizard is the anole is too fast. Kind of a clumsy and not a highly specialized predator, but they can eat anoles if they can catch them. We just don't think they do very often. Now, food chain length. So I showed you mean individual trophic position, but this is now island-wide food chain length. So taking the apical consumer on each island, and this is including spiders now. And so the first thing we have to account for is that food chain length increases with island area. That is consistent with work by Post showing that ecosystem size increases food chain length, although one of the only prior and it's consistent with another study from the Bahamas showing a similar effect of increasing food chain length with island area, but not inconsistent with a study published in Ecology by Hilary Young and colleagues from Palmyra in the Pacific, where they found that it was productivity and not ecosystem size that determined food chain length. So this is a potentially interesting result in and of itself, but not as interesting to me as this. So when we run a model, these are least square means of food chain length from a model that includes island area to account for that effect. And what we find is that adding either curly-tailed lizards or green anoles to islands with brown anoles only increases island-wide food chain length, whether it's the curly-tail that is the apical predator, whether it's the green anole that's the apical predator, whether it's Sagereye, or whether it's a spider. But adding both of them knocks it back down to what it's like when you only have one lizard. And what we think is happening, and what we think also explains the individual trophic position results, is that on these islands with both lizards present, all niche space is filled, and and intermediate links, and in particular we think spiders, are getting knocked out of the food chain. And that is, so it's sort of like knocking out the center block and reducing the food chain length, not from the top down, but by cutting out the middle. So counterintuitively, adding a top predator into this ecosystem does not necessarily increase food chain length. So it's the phrase trophic downgrading was coined to refer to cases where top predators are eliminated from ecosystems, and that reduces food chain length. Here we have a case where, depending on the context, adding more predators, because the green anole is also a predator, adding more species at the top of the food chain decreases food chain length. And so the last result here is that we have a trophic cascade. So the little leaf notcher that I mentioned, the second most abundant overall food, it looks like this. And this is the damage that it does to buttonwood leaves. And when we count the damage to buttonwood leaves across treatments, we see that it is it is at this level on control islands and increases when curly tails are added, potentially because there's that negative effect. So right now, brown anoles are very abundant on control islands. They are reduced in abundance on predator islands relative to control islands. So that might be part of it. When you add green anoles, the effect of the amount of plant damage decreases a lot, and that makes sense again because green anoles are a major predator of artipus. And then again, when you add predators to islands with green anoles and brown anoles, the amount of damage goes up again significantly. So in each case, whether green anoles are present or absent or present, adding the top predator dampens the trophic cascade and increases the amount of damage that plants are sustaining. That's just the result to remind us that artipus. All right, so I lied. This is the last result. We have found not entirely what we found by and in contrast to previous studies such as the Losos 2004 study. We are measuring hind limb length with X-rays, which enables us to do it very precisely. And Tim Thurman, who's a student with Rowan Barrett and is taking the lead on this project, has found that there has been evolution in favor of longer hind limbs where predators are present. So this is a significantly greater number of Haldanes or Haldane measure than 0. This is a non-significantly different measure from 0. Each point here is an individual island. So on islands with predators, lizards are evolving longer limbs. This is preliminary. Tim wanted me to tell you, but he also said it was fine for me to say that he's confident that it is going to hold up. So why we think this is happening? It's because we think it's because on the Shaner Islands, the amount of vegetation is very small, and there's few large trees. On our islands, which are an order of magnitude bigger, there are lots of bigger trees. So moving up doesn't necessarily require you to maneuver on very thin perches, and so what we're left with is you're still better off if you have longer legs and you can run fast on a broad substrate. So conclusions. It seems that primarily non-consumptive behavioral or fear-driven effects of predators collapse both the spatial and dietary niches, increase competition between anole species, reduce the likelihood of stable coexistence. 2 of 4 green anole species on islands with predators have gone extinct already, and 1 is on the brink still. And this is all consistent with our original hypothesis, too. Curly-tail lizards are an intragill predator. They are also exerting competitive pressure, which is probably contributing to the negative effects that they're having beyond just the competition, the fact that they're intensifying competition between the two anoles. They are also competing with brown anoles, especially. The addition of both top predators and mesopredators reduces individual trophic position and island-wide food chain length, which I think is interesting because it's counterintuitive. And the top predators, which again are not necessarily the apical predators, dampen the strength of a trophic cascade. And this is in kind of I haven't sort of fully. We don't know how many intermediate trophic links there are here, but there is this notion that the Fretwellian notion that as you add top predators, that will dampen, alternately increase or decrease the strength of trophic cascades, and this might be consistent with that. That's all. Yeah.
So you had the one slide about the populations. You said some of them went extinct, but yet you introduced in the islands. You said I think 5 to 6 individuals.
Mm-hmm.
For the nasty lizards.
Yeah.
And then I think 5 males and 5 females for the green lizards.
Yep.
Do you think any of those population dampenings were due to potential inbreeding?
It's a good question. I have no idea. There's the honest answer.
Are they annual breeders?
Yes.
And they have big clutches?
They have a clutch size of 1.
Oy. Oh.
I think, and they may.
All 3 or just the big nasty ones?
No, the 2 anoles. The curly-tailed lizards have multiple offspring clutches. I think someone in the audience might know better than I do whether there is more than one. I think maybe that during the breeding season, which sort of starts in May, and that they may produce single eggs multiple times. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know the answer to that. You guys all believe me? All right, yeah.
Would the metabarcoding pick up those predation events?
You would not believe how hard we tried. We weren't able to do that, and I think probably we might have been able to do it eventually. I mean, the problem obviously is that what you're getting there is you're trying to pick out lizard DNA from lizard DNA. And that's a bit tricky with the very short reads that we have to use. So finding a marker that will reliably distinguish brown anole DNA from curly-tail DNA, which is obviously going to be abundant in curly-tail feces, is tricky. I think I have no doubt that it's possible. We tried for about a year and decided we would give up. Yeah, that's about all I can say about that. It did not escape our attention that it would be nice if we could actually quantify the frequency of direct predation, but we weren't able to do it. Yeah.
All right. So do you think that these results would hold up in a more complex system, maybe with more prey or different prey, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, that's a great question, and I mean, I rolled this out and offered it to you guys as sort of relevant, pertinent to this big picture question of evolution in situ evolution on very large islands, and we're using these very small islands as a model. And I should have included in the conclusions that this result, contra the suggestions in the book passages from Losos's book that I quoted there, suggests that the predators are not likely to promote the kind of adaptive differentiation that we see based on these results in the anole radiation. I guess the argument I would make in favor is that in a more complex system you also have more anoles. So in islands with taller trees, there's in fact even on Staniel Key, the island where we stay, that's the settled island. There's a trunk anole that occurs in between Anolis disticus that occurs in between the two. So as arguably this is a model that sort of a model system of it's simplified, but it is sort of commensurate with the lizard diversity is commensurate with the scale of the ecosystems, and in a more complex ecosystem you'd have more structure, but also more species competing for that niche space. But and that's my sort of attempt to offer a positive response. The real answer is I don't know. I mean, obviously these three species do coexist in many places, and where the vegetation is much more complex. And I guess the question there is, on a much larger island, could another Anolis species invade? And I suspect that this space is fairly packed. Yeah.
Are you planning removals of the predators or the competitor and see if it returns back to the state of
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think we're thinking about what to do next. I think the first thing is to go back and see how the hurricanes of this past fall whether that may have been it for that third green anole population that was hanging on by a thread. And then in light of that, we're going to decide, I think, where to take it from here. And that, I think, would be a really interesting thing to do. And another thing so I've argued here that this is exclusively an indirect effect of the predator on the arboreal green anole. What we didn't do for lack of islands was a treatment with the green anoles alone or the green anoles with the predator to see if the predator would have a negative effect on the green anoles even if the brown anole weren't present. And that would be an experiment I'd also love to do. So yeah, that's a really good idea, and it's something I think we would like to do, and we'll see if we have the energy. Yeah.
Why was your result different with the brown anoles and the predator from the previous one? Why didn't they crash?
Again, I think it's because the larger size of the island means that there's more a greater availability of fairly substantial trees, 3-4 meter tall trees, sufficient that the behavioral response is there's enough arboreal habitat for those lizards to move up and not fill up all that space and some get left on the ground and get eaten. That's a bit hand wavy, but the behavioral response was almost immediate, and I think that they're sort of faced with the choice between staying on the ground and getting eaten, or moving up and facing more intense competition with a congeneric predator. They're choosing the latter, and so that is downstream having a negative population level consequence, but it's buffering the magnitude of that direct consumptive effect. The Chainer's Islands some of them will have three trees, buttonwood trees, and then a bunch of Rachycalis is a small coastal thing. I'm imagining, I've never actually been to those islands. I'm imagining that there are a lot of lizards trying to climb up out of the way, and just basically they can't. There's not enough room for them. They're probably chasing each other around and driving each other out of the refuges.
All the time we have. Thanks, bro.
Yeah, thank you guys.